Our scripture lesson today comes to us from the book of Philippians, the 4th chapter, verses 4 to 7. Hear the words of the Lord. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again I will say rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Do not worry about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. This ends the reading of God's holy word for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Ted. For 3 weeks now, I thought we would take a couple weeks to look at some of the great hymns of our faith. Many of us know and have some favorite hymns that we've sung over the years. Some of you might have some favorite gospel hymns that don't even appear in our hymnal. But there are some great hymns that have not just great lyrics and music that we sing and are our favorites, but there are some tremendous messages behind the hymns. Some of the writers have a story that, when you know their story, their personal story, reflects on the power of the words they penned in some of our hymns. Today we're going to hear about a tragedy that happened to a person and a family that resulted in the hymn you just sang, "It Is Well With My Soul." I don't sing that hymn the same as I once did, once I learned the story behind the writer. Some of our hymns are uplifting. Some are rather slow and almost morbid, aren't they? And there are some written that way on purpose. There is a Balm in Gilead, for example, is one example of that. But there is a plethora of ways to look at how people have written songs, and Marty even brought some of the newer ones in the praise melody today. And when we get to uncover some of the story behind the writers and their families and the experiences they had leading up to the writing of the story, many times that gives us a particular view that is insightful and helpful when we sing these words again. Ted read some words in Philippians I want to go back to in that first verse, because one could think that Paul has amnesia here or Alzheimer's because he's repeating himself in this verse 4. Let me read it again for you. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. He repeats twice the importance of rejoicing. This morning I asked Dee if you were a morning person, because she was rejoicing coming in early this morning. It was almost dark in here still with no lights on, and I heard her voice and her laughter. I concluded wrongly she must be a morning person. She just said sometimes. But sometimes rejoicing comes naturally, doesn't it? Sometimes we get up in the morning and we just want to sing. Last night I couldn't sleep so well, and it was about 1 o'clock in the morning, and you know what I heard? Birds, yes. Now, we've all heard the cicada, haven't we? That hum that keeps going and going. At the playground yesterday, Sellersburg, there were tons of these, and I was humored by the reaction of the people, even some of the boys, when these cicada flew near them or landed on their head. Some adult males even had some reactions that were funny to watch. But birds at 1 in the morning? Why are they rejoicing at some ungodly hour? Paul says that we should rejoice when? Always. Now, I'm sorry. I can't always do that. I mean, for example, there are mornings I get up, and I'm not a morning person, as you all know, and I'm feeling pretty good about things. Things are going well in the family, and the church, and the community, and I do feel like rejoicing. But some mornings, I wake up and I stub my toe. There are some things that happen in life that I don't feel like rejoicing for in that moment. And then we all experience not just low moments, but tragic moments. And do we feel like rejoicing then? Let's talk a bit about this hymn, It Is Well With My Soul. And to begin with that discussion, we have to talk about a family. This particular man was a prominent lawyer in Chicago. And his name was Horatio Spafford. Kind of sounds like a lawyer's name, doesn't it? Horatio Spafford. He married Anna, and they lived pretty well-to-do in Chicago, was a successful lawyer for many years, and even acclaimed some wealth through his profession, so much so that he started to buy up some real estate in Chicago. But then they had 5 children. And don't you know children are expensive? They are. I can tell you that. Look over here. Children are expensive. And they had 5. I only found pictures of 4 of them, but let me read their names for you because it's an important part of the story. Their names were Annie, Maggie, Bessie, Tanetta, and Horatio Jr. 5 in the brood, living in Chicago, doing well as a lawyer, buying some extra real estate, things going, as they say, a little better than hunky-dory. Going very well for this family. But in 1970, their family was struck by tragedy when, I forget which one it was now, the little one, Horatio Jr., died of scarlet fever. So we heard about the grandson, great-grandson, Ryan Jr. Back in those days, didn't have all the medical technology we have today, and we have a lot of technology today. But we know what it's like to worry over a little one in the hospital, or one that's born premature. And scarlet fever was a real problem back in the day. And in 1870, Horatio Jr. died of scarlet fever. That's the first of many tragedies in this family. A year later, 1871, was the Great Fire in Chicago. Remember reading about that in history? Pretty much the whole town was destroyed. I think 270 people died, and 90,000 people, 90,000 were homeless. That's a big family promise. 90,000 homeless people. All because of this great, humongous fire in the city of Chicago. I mentioned that Horatio had some real estate that he had bought, and it was all destroyed. His wealth was pretty much ruined. But he had his family, the 4 remaining children, his wife, and their home. Anna, his wife, was still grieving over their loss on the death of Horatio Jr., and wanting to provide some respite, some time away, some vacation, he decided to take the family on a voyage over to Europe. 1871, planning to leave in November. And the very day they were to leave, he had an emergency in his business, in the law business, and he could not go with them to Europe. He promised Anna he would take care of business and arrive as soon as possible after they were there. They said their goodbyes, they got on the boat, he went back to his work, and in that week, there was more tragedy in their family. We take travel today for granted, most of us do. But can you imagine 1871 trying to go from Chicago to Europe? There's not an airplane, right? There's just this journey to the coast, and then from the coast on this boat over to Europe. So Anna and her 4 children get on this ship, and they had their belongings for this trip, and they're looking so forward to being in Europe. And while they're out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, their boat is struck by another boat. And their boat sank in 12 minutes. Anna recorded later, much later in fact, that when she landed in the water, she was sucked down like in a vacuum. And you may have heard about some of the boats that have capsized and how there seems to be a whirlpool sometimes in effect, and this drawing down of objects and debris and bodies. And if you're in a shipwreck, there's a great force when that thing goes and capsizes into the water. She said, she wrote, she felt herself being pulled down into the water, sucked into the water as she held on to her daughter, the youngest daughter. And some debris came down that smashed into her arms and tore her daughter away from her in the water. She grasped again and caught part of the little gown she was wearing, but some more debris came down, ripped it away, and her daughter was gone. Anna surfaced, gasping for air, bewildered and not sure what was happening. And she found a plank, a piece of wood, to hang on to. Meanwhile, another young man who survived was on a piece of wood, of debris, and he came across 2 more of the Spafford daughters. And they hung on to each of his pockets, one on one side and one on the other, as he tried to find a bigger piece of debris that could all be out of the water. But after 30 minutes of searching and not finding anything bigger, he looked down, and they both closed their eyes and died. Anna, the wife of Horatio, was saved, got to Europe, and sent back a telegram that began with 2 words: saved alone. ... What shall I do? You can imagine when her husband received his telegram, he was devastated. Made plans quickly to move from Chicago to be with her in Europe, where she was alone. Got into a boat and was just coming to the site where his family's boat capsized. And the words that we just sang came to his mind. Husband, father of 5, who lost all 5 now, worried for his wife, writing the words, "It is well with my soul." Do you feel the power of that? I mean, I could understand if somebody who was a faith giant and had everything going for them and was a great preacher or proclamationer or some great person in the faith wrote those words. But these words came from a man who was in grief, who tragically lost just about all of his family. And writes, when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll. Whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well. It is well with my soul. After spending some time in Europe, Horatio and his wife Anna came back to Chicago, and they had 3 more children. Naming the first one Horatio Jr. again, not so much for his father, but for his brother who had died early from scarlet fever. 3 years later, he died of scarlet fever. And yet, it was still well with their soul. The question to me isn't if the sea billows are going to roll in our lives. The question is, what are we going to do when they do roll in our lives? You see, we don't all travel to Europe in a ship like they did. But we live our lives in very much the same way. We care for our families, we have our jobs, we do our business, we live in our community, we come to church, we grow our faith, we sing the song, "It is well with my soul." But is it really? Some days, yes. Some days, it's very well with my soul. Some days, not so much. John Wesley, our founding father, often asked a question, is it well with your soul? Maybe I ought to ask that question every Sunday. Is it well with your soul? John Wesley asked that question over and over to the point where people got sick of hearing him ask the question. But it was an important question. And it still is. Is it well with your soul? We have all kinds of things that happen in life. Good things, mediocre things, mundane things, boring things, and horrific things. And we are called to be faithful not only when things are going well, but even when things are not. I look at this songwriter, Marty, and I am full of admiration. I cannot imagine penning those words on the Atlantic Ocean near the spot where his 4 children died in that capsized boat. It certainly was well with his soul. Now we have a little parable that just happened this week in our church. Our softball team won their first game. That might not seem like a big important thing to you, but it is. When you've gone 41 games in a row and not won one, that, friends, is a tragedy. That's frustrating. That's annoying. Reminds me of the woman who lost her coin. Remember that story? That parable of the woman who lost her coin, the widow? She lost her coin, and she spent a day trying to find that coin. Remember back then they had dirt floors? She got her broom, she's sweeping all the corners and getting the light out and checking in those little bitty corners and finding where this coin could be, and she can't find it. And finally, when she finally does find it, what does she do? She rejoices and tells her neighbors. Sea billows will roll in our lives. There's no doubt. What makes us different is how we can be calm inside even when the storm is blowing like mad outside. I talk about a lot of personal stories, and I apologize for that, but I think it's important that we have real examples of how we can see our faith being important to us and helpful to us. When I was getting ready for this sermon today, I could not help but think about the day my dad died. It was a Monday before Thanksgiving. I was in the mountains where my dad and I had spent many, many days before in that same week. You know, I take vacation before Thanksgiving and right after. And I had spent literally well over decades of that week with my dad for 3 days, just dad and son, up in the mountains. Night before on Sunday, my dad called me because he wanted to be there, but he couldn't be with dialysis and other problems with his health. And we talked for an hour and a half. We had a great conversation. A little after 6 o'clock in the morning, I got a phone call, and as soon as I picked up the phone and heard my brother's voice, I knew exactly what he was going to say. I don't know why, I don't know how, but somehow I just knew what he was going to say. And I had 3 hours to get things together and drive down to my mom and my brother to be with them. And I'll tell you that those 3 hours were not what I expected. I expected to be a mess. I expected to be very, very, very sad. Almost a mess, couldn't drive, I didn't know. But as I began that journey, gathered things together and got in my truck, those 3 hours were the most cathartic hours I have ever experienced in my whole life. My mind ran back. I'm riding down the road, down the mountain, and my mind goes back to some great times I had with my dad. And I remember in that moment, just remembering what a great dad he was for me. And I also remember him saying over and over again to his family, to all of us, that when he dies, don't cry for me because they're selfish tears. Instead, be happy for me because I'll be where I need to go. The other night, I found some pictures of a wedding I had done for my friend, my brother's friend, and found some pictures of my mom and my dad dancing. My dad loved to dance. He always had a smile on his face. He loved to dance. I'm not so much a dancer. But I saw those pictures, and it brought back those memories again. And I almost cried until I remember those words again. Don't cry. Those are selfish tears. Now, it's okay to cry. We're going to cry when the sea billows roll. But what do we really believe fundamentally? What do we really believe? Do we say the Apostles' Creed and really believe it, or do we just recite it as part of worship time? Do you believe in the resurrection of the dead? I do. Horatio Spafford certainly did. Anna certainly did. The question for us is when we sing our songs of faith, when we sing the great hymns of the church, do we just sing them or do we believe them and live them? That's what it's all about. We can sing all kinds of words. We can say all kinds of words. But what really fundamentally matters is how we live our lives and how we live our faith and how we rejoice at victories and even over storms that threaten our lives and the lives of our families. Rejoice. Again, I say rejoice. It is well with my soul. How is it with yours? Amen.